building, but in case you're not, or if you're not familiar with this part of the building, restrooms are right back out the way you came. Men's room is to the right, ladies' room is to the left, and there's signage that will guide you. There are two people, at least, that I am deeply indebted to this evening. Number one is our guest, and I'll say more about that in a second. The other one is Jerry, because he has agreed to video the presentation and then upload it on our YouTube channel, because several people that were interested in coming could not be here. There's a band concert, imagine that. There's all kinds of activities going on that knock people out of being able to be here. So we'll upload it on the YouTube channel, and he can edit it and make it what we need it to be. In the event, Luke will break at about the 45-minute mark and give you a chance for Q&A. Let me put your mind at ease. Luke is going to repeat the question that you ask. Your voice will be deleted, so you don't have any fear or worry of the question you ask and somebody figuring out who's who. We'll edit and make all that presentable before we upload it to the YouTube channel. Did I just make sense?
Yes, sir.
Okay. The other person that, as I mentioned, is our guest. I was introduced to Luke through Megan Gordiani. They used to work together, and we've had a couple of conversations and visits and coffee actually once, and I've just learned to appreciate and love this young man. He loves the Lord. He loves what he's doing, and I appreciate the fact that when Jesus died on the cross, he died for the whole person. He wants my physical person well, he wants my spiritual person well, and he wants my mental person well. And I'm also glad to be a part of a church and a congregation that sees the need for that and to understand that. And so that's going to be Luke's presentation. Presentation number one will deal with stress, anxiety, depression, that kind of thing. Then a few minutes of Q&A. We'll have a short break, and then he'll come back and talk about the boundaries of screen time and how to deal with that. So without further ado, would you welcome Luke Jackson?
This microphone?
Absolutely.
Okay. Hello? Hello. May need assistance. Maybe just up more. This is not over here. Starting out hot. As Graham grabs the microphone, hey, I'm Luke. Good to see all of you. Just a quick background about myself. I'm a therapist. I have my own practice in Rogers, and super grateful to just honestly, if you've never been in the therapy setting before, it's really a sacred place for someone to be willing to just talk about the pain that they're having, about themselves, or about a relationship that they have. It's really, I don't take it for granted what I get to do every day. So like it was mentioned, I'm a therapist, I enjoy what I get to do. But this is also a really energy and life-giving thing I get to do too. Like I really enjoy giving presentations, and I've been trained to do this and to give lectures about specific mental health topics. So if it's okay with you guys, we're just going to kind of jump in, and like it was mentioned, we'll have a bit of time for Q&A at the end. So I'm excited to just engage with you guys and see what questions come up for you. Where do I point this?
Luke is the down arrow.
That was the issue. It wasn't the movement, it was the arrow. He even told me before, hang on. So kind of a quick overview of where we're going today with this first lecture. It's about stress, self, and mental health. And I know I did not mean to rhyme that on purpose, but I am glad it did rhyme. But one of the concepts to talk about stress is the window of stress tolerance. And some of you may be vaguely familiar with that, but we're going to kind of take a deep dive into that so that whenever stress does come up, we can have a few tools to navigate stress. We'll also dive into not only how do we navigate when I'm stressed, but if any of you are parents in the room, or if any of you deal with kids or teenagers in any kind of capacity, whether you're a teacher or anyone who works or coaches kids, there's also something to be said about how do I help this younger person regulate themselves, and we'll talk a bit about that too. And then, like it was mentioned too, we're going to dive into a few common mental health challenges, specifically anxiety, depression, and some of the things that those entail. And then after that, we'll dive into some coping skills and some other things. So we're accomplishing a lot, and that's why I want to make sure I make room for your questions, since we're going to be accomplishing a lot. So I'm going to go ahead and keep jumping in. First thing, getting to know stress. Does anyone know stress? Anyone know who she is? Yeah? Or he? I shouldn't call it she. Go ahead and as we, my wife's at home, you can have her number afterwards. As we get started here, just reach out to a partner or somebody near you and just start talking about what is the first way for you that you notice that your blood's starting to boil, that you're starting to get a little stressed? What's that first sign that tells you you're getting stressed? I'll give you like 2 minutes to talk to a partner. Raise it up. Tell each other. Yeah, tell each other. It's not a confession. Give you guys about 10 seconds to wrap up your conversations. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I was observing the body language of the room, and it feels like you're all more stressed now. I just want to take responsibility of that. Have you guys ever played that game of, have you done this, hold up a finger? Well, we're going to go ahead and play that right now. Here are all the signs you can see on the screen. Oh, gosh. There are a lot of ways that stress shows. Maybe for you it shows physically. Maybe that's what you notice first. Maybe you can't sleep. Maybe you sleep too much. Maybe you're exhausted. Maybe there's like this fatigue that just follows you around. Maybe you feel it in your muscles. I feel stress in my shoulders a lot. I feel it in my neck a lot. Sometimes I get headaches, sometimes I'm actually more vulnerable to illness. So sometimes stress hits us physically, right? Stress also hits our behaviors. Maybe you're more irritable, maybe you're a bit likely to get angry, maybe you tend to isolate or alienate yourself, maybe you distance yourself in relationships. Maybe you go to kind of black and white thinking, maybe you tend to resort to other ways of coping, like this is when you do tend to drink more alcohol, this is when you tend to use drugs. I'm not sure behaviorally how you adapt when stress hits you. Stress can also hit us in our cognitions or the affective. Sometimes we get anxious. Sometimes we get like hypersensitive to different things. Sometimes we become cynical. Like when stress hits us, we just start to kind of view everything in this negative light. We begin to feel hopeless. Maybe we numb. There's a lot of different ways it can hit us, but what is common is a lot of us, when we do feel stressed, we don't really regulate super well. It's really hard when it feels like it's all caving in on us. How do I handle this except for this and this way? Some of us overthink. Some of us avoid. Maybe if that thing hits us, that stresses out, we just avoid it. We distract. We consume. The one thing we don't do oftentimes is to kind of go through the painful or the stressful experience. We find these other ways to maneuver around it. And as a result of that, the stress just kind of goes away for a little bit, but then it kind of comes back to bite us. And it's really hard. I bring up this, on the slide you can see Permission to Feel, Dr. Mark Brackett. He wrote a lot of content about emotional intelligence, and if you're a bookworm like I am, you might want to check out his book. He talks about just the different ways of, it's challenging to regulate ourselves. Also, a lot more books on the screen now. I've read almost all of them, actually. Dr. Dan Siegel, if you've heard of him, if you're looking for a guy who has good parenting books, who has good books on like just knowing your brain or having awareness and mindfulness, he would be a great person to start with, whether it's on YouTube or in his books. And specifically his concept of the window of stress tolerance is what we're going to dive into. Here it is. And whenever I introduce this concept of window of stress tolerance, I actually like to use myself as an example, so I'm going to go ahead and kind of use myself. So sometimes when stress begins to hit me, it's almost like my nervous system or my body starts to speed up a little bit. It's almost like, and as that happens, I might be more irritable, I might have less patience with my kids, I might overfunction, I might work harder, I might answer that email at 7 p.m. even though I shouldn't. I might, if someone comes at me, I might be more likely to be defensive. I speed up, I do that as long as I can. I'm actually really productive, which is what makes this hard. But then guess what happens next? As soon as I soar into hyper-arousal, like I'm extra aroused for a while, I go down into hypo-arousal. This is when I run out of juice. I kind of go numb. Maybe I freeze. If someone comes to me, my wife comes to me with something, I'm just going to say, I don't know. I'm just going to maybe disengage. Maybe this is where the shame comes in. Maybe if you've dealt with depression, if you've dealt with feeling extra passive, it's hard to make decisions, it's hard to be assertive. We withdraw. We go into hypo-arousal. But then at some point, we have to figure out how to go back up, so then we just gotta, it's almost like we've been procrastinating, so we gotta go back up, and it's this vicious cycle, and it's exhausting. It really is exhausting. And this may not be your exact pattern of how you deal with stress. Sometimes we, depending on who you are, depending on what makes you you, maybe you go into hypo first. Maybe you tend to just sort of shut down or disengage before going to hyper. I'm not sure what makes the most sense for you. What I do know is when we are within our window of stress tolerance, when we're in that like happy place, this is what I picture. I picture this ability to be balanced, flexible. Like if something comes at me, I burst a tire. That's terrible, it's super annoying, but like it's okay, I can deal with it, I can figure out, I can rearrange my schedule and maybe some finances to try and figure out, like the world isn't ending. But if I'm not within my window, if the tire burst, then that means my entire soul was just set on fire and everything's over and I'm gonna be super stressed out and our budget's out the window, I make a new spreadsheet, I get critical of my wife and everything happens and now I'm in huge trouble and my tire's still dead. So you can sense that in our window, if we are in our window of tolerance, this is kind of where we want to be. We can feel balanced, we can regulate our emotions, we're playful, we're usually more interested in pleasure or even sexual activity here. We are able to just breathe through life, even if stress is kind of compounding us. This is a really good place to be. But, like I said, sometimes we get knocked out of this. So if you're similar to me, maybe you lean towards hyper-arousal. I know it's a lot of text up there, I'm not sure if you can read it, but I'm going to read a little bit about this. You know, hyper-arousal is when stress hits you, it means you often have a tendency to increase your activity. It's almost, some people describe it, you know, it feels like anxiety, it feels like you want to jump out of your skin, it feels like you want to run, like just flat out run or fight, like you have this just, like it just rises in you. And that might be impulsive, it might be intense reactions, it might be some tension in your body that you're just, almost like you're holding back. This also is where addictions can kind of come in, like if you feel this way, it doesn't feel very good, so I gotta find a way to cool it. Maybe that's even coffee, maybe that's even alcohol, like we find a way to subdue it here. And this is a hard place to be in for long term. It kind of feels like we're out of control sometimes here. Hypoarousal is when you're in this different kind of state and you tend to actually disengage. You maybe actually, you can also feel anxious here too, so that I wouldn't just label anxiety in the hyperarousal, but you can, it's almost like you, sorry, my next picture. It's almost like your responsiveness decreases and you experience like a numbness about it. You're sort of exhausted. I keep doing this with my hands because this is kind of what it is. It's kind of helpless, like everything's out of my control. Maybe this is where you go numb. Some people actually tell me, I actually don't remember what happened because I was so numb, because I was so done, that I truly, like there's no memory about what happened with that. And I believe them actually. I think part of even our brains can shut down to the point where the memory doesn't even stick with us. Lower levels of energy, we shut down. And actually, if y'all are familiar with the word placate, this might be where we placate too, where we are so tired we don't want to be assertive and express what we actually think. I'm just going to placate and tell you what you want to hear. I'm just going to be a people pleaser, and I'm just going to get through because I can't handle this disapproval. I can't handle going against something like this. So we sort of just do that. And that's a really challenging place to be long term too. So I bring this up because I want you to number one, maybe catch yourself when you begin to drift either to the hyper or to the hypo. Maybe notice your body. Notice your body's response to the stress. And second off, I want to introduce this because, as you can see up here, research shows that some of the most common mental illnesses, as you can see, 19% of adults have some sort of anxiety disorder. 8% have depression. These are often really correlated with people being sort of stuck in that hyperarousal or hypoarousal states. There's a lot of correlation going to be there. So I hope you can, my hope for you, just to be super direct with you guys, my hope is that if you want to learn more about this window of stress tolerance concept, or if you want to start thinking about these things, maybe just you start noticing when it first hits you and notice what your trajectory is. Where do I tend to go next? And if you can catch yourself earlier in the trajectory, then you might save yourself from getting 3 steps down the way. And before you know it, if you've been hyper-aroused for 3 days, you're going to have a lot of things behind you that you don't want to be, you don't want to do. And the same is true for hypoarousal. In light of that, I want to jump into a really related topic, common mental health challenges. Maybe I shouldn't do that time. I'm going to jump right in. So, everyone gets nervous. I just want to start off with that. I think sometimes we overuse these words like anxiety and depression. Sometimes we underuse them. There is a stigma, but I also think we sometimes overuse them. Me and Megan and I were just talking about how sometimes different organizations like schools, for example, can see something happening, and maybe it is anxiety that's happening, and then there is some true needed support there. Or it could just be that this person's having some actual normal nervousness happening. So one distinction I like to make with this is, it's from Brene Brown, if you've heard of her. Imagine if you're walking through a forest. We were just talking about coffee in the woods. Imagine you're going to coffee in the woods at Kohler. I hope this never happens to you, and I hope I don't ruin that coffee shop for you. But imagine you're walking to that trail, you're about to get some good coffee, then all of a sudden, there's a bear. A live bear. My instinct would be to run as fast as I could if I saw that bear. But as soon as you see that bear, what would your body do? It would just elevate it, it would activate it, your heart would beat faster. You would immediately, probably without even thinking about it, you wouldn't have to think, maybe I should turn around and avoid this threat. His teeth look big, so no, you wouldn't even think about it. You would instinctually turn around and run and respond to the threat. But once you got away from the bear, if it's normal nervousness, if the threat goes away, if you've already taken the test, if you've already dealt with that interview, if you've already dealt with the thing that is causing you the stress, typically your nervousness goes down. It's temporary. With anxiety though, anxiety is almost like this severe, long-lasting nervousness that is there, but the bear isn't there. It's like your body elevates, it activates as if there is a threat again and again and again. And it gets to the point where this anxiety is so debilitating that it actually interferes with your ability to function. It's hard to relate to others, it's hard to get your stuff done at work, it's hard to be a parent, it's hard to be yourself. because this is getting in the way for so much. And there's physical stuff too. I'll mention this in a minute, but your body responds to it, and it's the wear and tear on your body begins to show in certain ways. And on top of that, like I mentioned, like socially, home, school, these things are impacted. And that's what clinical anxiety looks like versus normal nervousness. Now, I think that distinction is really important. I know that's a lot of words up there, but there's a lot of physical symptoms of anxiety. There's a lot of physical symptoms. Again, when our brains perceive something as unsafe, and again, it doesn't have to be, your life doesn't have to be threatened for your brain to sense that something's unsafe. Even if you see a facial expression on your child or your spouse or your friend, that could send your brain a signal immediately that something is unsafe about your relationship, even in that moment. Maybe I literally had a conversation today when my husband does this eyebrow thing. It immediately sends me this. It starts burning my heart and my stomach, and then I messed up immediately. Like that, how quick that works is just amazing. And yet it's also terrifying because when our bodies and minds sense a threat, we always have this radar in our minds searching for threats. When the threat's sensed, it's like we have this body response. The accelerator goes on, the accelerator goes on, and if the accelerator stays on, a lot of these physical symptoms up here y'all linger, like our heart pounds, we have a headache, it's hard to sleep, we have a low sex drive, we have tense muscles. There's just so much because it's like if your car was just running, and you just had your foot on the gas pedal for so long, of course your car would start to be impacted, and it's the same for our bodies too. In addition to our bodies being impacted from anxiety, our thoughts and mental states get hit too. We worry. We have intrusive thoughts. If you're familiar with intrusive thoughts, what that often looks like is if you're just driving in the car and then bam, you get hit by this thought of like something happening to you and your family, and it's so vivid, and it's like these thoughts just randomly hit you all the time, and it's so intrusive. Thoughts about worst case scenarios, thoughts about, it's hard to concentrate. It's hard to even just picture a future with some of these thoughts that hit people. And again, these are consistent things. Anxiety can be really hard. It can be really hard to manage and to get through. And it's huge. It hits a fifth of our population at least at this point. In contrast to anxiety, there's also depression. These are probably the two more common mental illnesses that I'm going to just address a little bit today, and again, we'll have more time on Q&A if you have more questions about it. I want to distinguish depression from SAD, and I'll go ahead and, this isn't on the slide, but I'll go ahead and also distinguish depression from grief too, because sadness and grief are pretty similar, at least in my brain. SAD and grief send us signals that something has been lost, something that has happened, that this is important, but something didn't work out. Something was lost. Something happened, and I'm discontent about it, and now I really feel that. And just like with anxiety versus worry, our normal nervousness, we all have our tendencies when we get sad. Some of us, when we're sad, we like to cling to our loved ones and tell them because that's kind of how we regulate ourselves. Sometimes when other of us get sad, we go by ourselves and isolate and let that feeling digest by ourselves. But with sadness, or normal sadness, again, this is sort of a wave that washes through us. This is a wave that washes through us. Everyone gets sad. Everyone has grief. I was just talking before the start today that I had to do my grandmother's funeral a few weeks ago. And that grief, it just hits you in waves. And that doesn't mean something's wrong with you. That grief, that sadness just signals that something was important to you, that you've lost, and this is actually a good part of our hearts and our brains. It doesn't mean something's wrong with you, but I think oftentimes when we do have sadness, we get tricked and we think that something's wrong with us, but it's actually okay. It's actually okay. It's actually brave to feel the sadness, to feel the grief. But to distinguish this from depression, depression is something that is enduring. It's a mood change that lasts at least 2 weeks. The sadness, the heavy feeling, it lingers. Physical symptoms, like it actually can involve anxiety too. For teenagers especially, it might not look like Eeyore, like from Winnie the Pooh. Like it might not be like Eeyore sadness. It might actually be like frustration all the time, irritability all the time, fatigue, insomnia, big appetite, low appetite, big gain of weight, big loss of weight. There's a lot of different ways we get hit physically again. But the main thing that I hope you can hear is with depression, all of these physical and mental symptoms cause clinically significant distress in something. That you can't do school, you can't do home, and you can't do social because of whatever's happening to you. So it's a pretty big distinction that I hope you can see for you and yourself and your loved ones. I'm not trying to belittle anything that you or your loved ones might be feeling, but I think that distinction can be freeing for some people, and it's important to make. I'm going to go quickly so we can get to our Q&A. So just right along with me, we're almost at Q&A. One thing that they had asked me to talk about tonight was like self-esteem. And I think when someone struggles with depression, specifically, self-esteem is one of the first, and maybe even one of the more painful things that tends to be impacted. So what you see on the screen is this phenomenon in our brains called the negativity bias. Sometimes whenever we have one negative experience, it hurts. We get stressed, we have some sort of reaction, kind of like what we talked earlier. And so we have a negative experience, then we have a reaction to it, but then this locks in as a memory. Oh, like when I got embarrassed at work and I missed something, I kind of went into hyperdrive and tried to prove myself that I was right, and it was really embarrassing, and I had to kind of walk away, and I felt a lot of shame. That gets locked in as a memory, and then what happens next in our brains is really important. I hope you guys don't miss this. After this negative experience and our response to this negative experience, and when that gets locked into our brains do this amazing thing. It tries to protect us. Our brain tries to protect us from that pain happening again. But here's where it gets tricky. After we experience that, we have a response, and that's locked in as a memory, we start to be on the hunt for how can I prevent that betrayal, that embarrassment, that shame from happening again. I'm going to do all I can to make sure I sniff out any aspect of that happening again. So we actually start to look, if it happens again and again and again, and we have all these reinforcements inside of us in our brains, we are really sniffing out these negative things to protect ourselves. And before we know it, we lose a lot of positive, intimate experiences. So all we digest is the negative, because it's what we're looking for. And we tell people, well, if you would just see the silver lining, if you would just see the positive, you would feel better, and just read the fortune cookie again. Like, just do it. But it's not as simple as that. Like, I hope you can see the complexity of this, that our brains and our hearts are trying to protect us with this. And especially with young people today, we're going to talk about this in the next presentation, but when they feel like their belonging is questioned, when they feel like they're taken out of their group, and I think we as adults know this too, then this is really just a huge, huge weight. And we do everything we can to prevent any sort of exclusion again. But then what we often miss is the thoughts we think about ourselves, the assumptions that we make about ourselves, that I will always be this unsuccessful person in business meetings now because I messed up that one time, and I can't let that happen again, or I'll never be the husband I can be because again and again I messed up, or I won't ever be able. We just protect ourselves, but what it actually looks like is low self-esteem, and it's debilitating. It's a big part of depression that we don't talk about. And I wish I could spend more time on it, but I also want to get to suicide. This is a heavy one. Just kind of came out of nowhere. I apologize if I gave you warning. I've done a lot of suicide training, suicide prevention programs in schools. I've gone to different schools and churches and talked about suicide, and it's one of those painful things that you can tell my tone lowers. This is a serious way to go deal for a lot of us. Some of us may even know loved ones who've gone through this, and what I don't have enough time to talk a lot about suicide, but I'll say two quick things about it. The first thing is the suicide rates among adolescents it has been increasing for some time, and the numbers do show that COVID didn't help that. But what I also want to mention is this acronym, ACT, which is, if you're in the education world, it happened to land on ACT, Inspire, which is ironic, but acknowledge, care, and tell. This is the acronym we've talked to a lot of students, that if they have a friend, a peer, that is struggling and they see signs that could lead to suicide, acknowledge what the difference you see in your friend, tell them you care, and then tell a trusted adult. So that's kind of what you teach. I've taught students, but for parents, you sort of do the same thing. Like if you have a child in your life or a teenager in your life and you notice some signs that they're skipping classes, that they're struggling in some way, you notice some actual like debilitating signs, like we talked about earlier with depression or anxiety. Acknowledge what you see. Hey, I've noticed you skipped a lot. Hey, I noticed you haven't been to church at all. Hey, I've noticed that you've sort of seemed down recently. Acknowledge it. And I think C is maybe almost as important as the T. C, acknowledge that you care. Tell them that you care, because if we don't tell young people that we care, they don't care what we're saying. Yeah. So acknowledge that, like, hey, I'm just reaching out because I care. Like, I'm not trying to come down on you. I'm not trying to make you feel any kind of way. I take seriously how you're doing, and I just want to check on you. And after you tell me you care, then for adults, make yourself available. Tell them that they can come to you with any small or big problem. And again, this won't be a fix-all, but in these conversations, be open, try not to lecture. Research shows that if you keep these conversations short and not rushing them, that they tend to be more effective, and be okay to take a break. I think a lot of for young people, especially if we try to lecture them or give them a lot and kind of throw the kitchen sink at them. As a parent, I have 3 little ones myself. It would be very triggering, very activating for me if any of my kids started to talk about this. So I totally want to validate the tendency to just to be hyper-aroused on my kids because of this, because it's their lives we're talking about. Sure. So if I can regulate myself, create space for myself, create space for them, tell them I care, and then just leave it open. This won't solve everything, but this is sort of, if you can just remember ACT, A-C-T, tell young people to acknowledge care and tell with their friends, and for parents and people who work with adolescents, acknowledge care and tell. I hope that can stick with you. Okay, this last little section, and I'm going to be brief because I know we get to Q&A, is called coping and connecting. I've talked a lot about the mental health challenges. Now we're going to talk about how it actually is possible to come back within our window of tolerance. It's possible for ourselves and possible for the young people that we live with and work with to get back in that awesome place of our window of tolerance. One big way that I think is really important is just mindfulness or breathing. Now, some people, when I bring up breathing in these sort of talks, like, oh, here comes the deep breath talk from a therapist, like, great. I get it. If you could just remain present with me for 30 seconds. I think this is, if we like it or not, and I think it sort of is oversimplified. If you would just breathe, your depression would go away. If you would just breathe, it's not that simple. But, like I've been talking about, if you can catch yourself earlier when you start to go into hyper or hypoarousal, if you start to catch yourself when stress begins to hit you, then if you combine that with some sort of way like breathing to regulate yourself and to notice what's happening in your body, it actually has a lot of profound effects. So I'll kind of use one example that hit me today. I was running late again in a session. Had a session that 9 to go long, so I was coming in hot for my 10, and I know I have a propensity to, if I'm running late, I'm just going to sprint. I'm going to sit down in a chair. What's going on? Tell me what's going on. Oh yeah, that's so hard. And I jumped right into the session, and it's almost like I hand a client my own anxiety, which is probably terrible to admit on tape. But I think just being aware of what my body tends to do in a moment when I'm running late. Okay, I tend to go into hyperarousal. So what I do, this is actually what I do, y'all, so I'm giving you all the secrets of my practice. I go to the kitchen, open up the freezer, I stick my head in the ice thing, and I feel the coolness of the freezer. Like I'm mindful of it. I focus on that. I focus on nothing else mentally, but just the coolness hitting my face. I focus on my breathing just for 30 seconds. I notice I try to make my exhale twice as long as my inhale, so. feel it? It truly can help me come down. It can help me slow down. It can help me be more present. It can bring my best self to what I'm doing. There's a lot of research out there. There's even videos out there, different ways you can do this. But I hope you can find your way of trying to notice what happens and to breathe in the moment and give yourself 30 seconds to be your best self. And I think you'll be impressed with what happens. Quick few things and we'll get to Q&A. The good news. I think this is huge for kids too, and for your teenagers, and for ourselves too. Am I eating enough? Have I exercised any time recently? Am I drinking enough water? And have I been sleeping well? If you can take care of these things and monitor these things with your young people, you will there isn't research as much, but I would estimate that a lot of the issues that we're noticing that send us these alarm bells might be taken care of. So that's the first thing that I think of with my own kids. I have a 6, 3, and 1-year-old, and that's the first thing I think of. Okay, have I fed these little things? Have I given them enough water? How is their sleep? Okay, if it's not that, okay, there's probably something else. I think we just need to kind of check in about this with ourselves and check in about this with our young people, because sometimes it is as simple as, oh, this is not meeting the cut. Another thing, this is for the parents out there especially, sometimes we need to get back to the simple things like physically connecting with our kids. Our teenagers probably won't want some, maybe they would, a big bear out here or something cute holding their hand, but I think especially for younger kiddos, that it can do wonders. Like sometimes less words and somehow connecting physically to the young people can regulate their nervous system and regulate ours. That might be offering a cold drink of water, that might be sitting next to them. I don't know what it is, but just co-regulation, it has so much research behind it, and just thinking about how can I regulate myself to regulate with my young person, and just keep that in mind. It might be through conversation too. Being intentional on what time you have together after this, you might not be able to read it, but just talking about different topics. Another one that I'm going to skip for now, but I might have you do it during, actually I'm going to go ahead and do this. During break, after Q&A, I'm going to put this slide back on the screen and give you like 3 minutes of homework, or break work. Rose, thorn, and bud. It's one of my favorite exercises. This is good for coworkers, good with kids, good with spouses, good with anybody you're trying to connect with. But what you do is, a rose is something positive in your life that you're looking forward to. Thorn is a challenge, something that you need help with. Bud is something that you are excited about. Research shows if you share something like these things with someone, a lot of magic stuff happens in our brains and in our hearts that actually, like, through the science of mirror neurons, which this is a weird graphic, but the science of the mirror neurons, the science of something happens in our brains when we gel with somebody, when we are able to connect, when we feel validated by someone in front of us, we actually, without even knowing it, we imitate people we're talking to. Our tones match, our eyes match, our facial, our body language matches. So if we can feel that, it changes a lot of things. It has a lot of really important and profound effects. And the stats actually show this, especially for adolescents. Research shows that if a teenager has a secure attachment with a caregiver, this actually serves as a really big protective factor against suicidal thoughts, suicidal behaviors, and self-harm. So in other words, research shows that if a teenager has a secure attachment, they will be less likely than their peers without a secure attachment to their caregivers to have suicidal ideation. This isn't, of course, 100% foolproof, but I will say the research strongly suggests that this is a huge deal. Having secure attachments is a huge deal, and this is actually, a lot of the work I do involves secure and insecure attachments. So as I wrap up before the Q&A, y'all, you've been patient with me. I actually don't even fish. It's funny that I use this, but which boat would you want to be on? If you can't see the screen, there's a boat with literal lightning strikes and a lot of water just going up and down. It does not look like a good day. And then the boat next to it is just so calm and tranquil. I'm showing you these images, and I want you to, if you want, you can close your eyes and imagine yourself on the boat with all the storm. Think of how you would feel if you were standing on a boat in the middle of the ocean and there's lightning around you, there's storms, everything's rocking, all the stuff around you is going flying, and you're not sure of your safety, you're not sure if you'll survive, you're not sure if who's going to be okay, you're not sure of what's going to happen. Everything in your world's being rocked. Your heart's beating so fast, you're trying to do all you can. You're, of course, not playful, you're not your window. Imagine if that's how you felt all the time. Whereas, in contrast to that, put yourself in the boat. The boat where it's calm. The boat where you can focus on the sereneness around you. That you feel so secure that you could plan a month budget on that right boat. You could conquer anything if you feel that peace inside of it, if you feel that security in you. This is the power of a secure relationship, whether it's with your partner, whether it's with your kid, whether it's with a friend. Security in our relationships can actually be our safe haven in the storm. That even if I'm on the boat on the left, if my life is throwing me 80,000 different things and I'm just being plummeted with stress, if I have someone next to me that I love holding my hand physically and also emotionally through this thing, I can get through it. And that is the power of secure attachment. And this is the last slide that we'll jump into Q&A. They asked me to talk a little bit about God, and as it was mentioned, I'm going to take my therapist hat and put it right here for a minute and put on my personal hat, if you don't mind. When I see clients, I work within my client's worldview. When I go home, I'm a Christian. And I believe there has been times in my life to where my relationships were pretty rocky. I felt like my parents didn't hear me. I feel like my friends left me. I feel like any sort of dating relationship was just a dumpster fire. And I didn't have security. I didn't feel secure in my relationships, and it was really hard. But I did know that God was there for me in those times. I did know I had some people speak life into me that showed me that even though, I felt like my life was on the boat on the left, everything was rocky, that I knew that God was with me. I knew that I had a safe haven, that even though all this is happening, that God would still be with me. And what's funny is research does show that there is something to be said about having a secure bond with, research would kind of make it more politically correct and say it like any sort of attachment figure, including God. But personally, I've experienced the security from Him, knowing that I'm not alone, knowing that I have someone always there for me. And I'm not sure where, again, I don't know a lot of you, and I'm not sure where you are with your relationship with God, and that may be a whole other subject for you. But they asked me to kind of speak personally about, how this integrates for me, and I think this is the main way it integrates for me. So I wanted to put that out there, and now I'll put my therapist hat back on. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into some Q&A. I know I'm running a little bit late, so we'll probably cut Q&A to about 5 minutes, if that's okay. Maybe 7, if we're crazy. So from all those 1,900 things I just said, what questions are coming up for you guys? And like it was mentioned earlier, if you ask a question, I'll repeat the question, and your voice will be cut out of this. So. Really good question. The question was, if there is a distinction between grief and depression, how long can grief exist without it becoming depression? Super good question. Off the cuff, I think a couple of important things to think about there. The first thing is, how is the grief hitting this person? There is technically, if we're going to get super technical, in the DSM-5, which is the therapist diagnosing Bible. It's awful. There is technically some verbiage in there that talks about complex bereavement, and they've actually kind of made that a bit of it goes back and forth, but they've kind of made it a separate entity in itself. So I'm giving you the roundabout answer to say I think it depends on how grief is hitting someone, how debilitating, how much clinically significant stuff is happening. Is this person able to function in these important areas? It's a big question I would think about. As far as timeline, I'm not a specialist. I don't specialize in grief, I'll say, but from what I've read and what I've experienced myself and with others, grief is not predictable. Grief hits everyone differently. And you could even grieve someone who's still living too. You could grieve, there's just so many things and ways that you can grieve. So I think if you're trying, it's almost like as I digest your question, how do I know when grief is clinically warranted to get help? This is a cliche, I think anybody could use a therapist or some sort of support with any kind of grief, no matter how long it lasts. Someone to meet you and sit with you in that place. But I would say if the grief persists and it's causing a lot of distress, if it's causing a lot of anger, if you're taking it out on your work or your family, and it just persists and it's not getting better, but maybe if it's getting worse, I think that would be a lot of red flags. It's hard to give a timetable, but I think I've read some articles about how if it persists more than 6 to 8 months, maybe, and if it's not getting, if the distress is getting worse, and if it's hard to function at that point, you may want to evaluate, let's get some help here, let's shift something. So, to answer your question, yeah. Any other questions? I will say too, if your question, if you're not sure right now, in my second presentation, I'm going to have a QR code which you can scan with your phones, and if you want to submit a question anonymously on a Google form to me later, and if that feels safer to submit your question, that's going to be available in our second presentation. So just throwing that out there. Not trying to. Go ahead. The question was, if suicide rates are increasing post-COVID, how does that trend make sense? What contributes to that? To give an answer to that, not backed by explicit research, but just a therapist opinion, I think a lot of it has to do with, you hear a lot about social anxiety coming out of the pandemic due to the isolation that was happening. And I think the anxiety, as it hits adolescents again and again and again, combined with some of the technology tendencies, that concoction makes it really hard to engage, makes it really hard to get positive stimuli, makes it really hard to express and to find some sort of release and to form secure relationships, because why would I go out if I'm having this debilitating social anxiety after all this? So my hunch, again, this isn't research informed, my hunch has to do some with social anxiety, has to do some with increasing technology usage and the role of just having a hard time coping with the anxiety, and it's really hard to be young person these days, so that's my hunch.